All right, let's wrap up part 3 of Satan. We have emails to get to, and we'll see where that goes. It wasn't until the New Testament that Satan begins to become the personification of evil and a sinister opponent against God as a being. And this stuff is not made up by me. I've consulted a lot of very scholarly people who research it, and I look at their stuff. Some are right, some are wrong. I'm wrong. But as we said in the weeks before in the Old Testament, Satan's mostly talked about, if at all, in the book of Job. And there he's depicted as when the sons of God gathered together, Satan was among them, and as a being that has both access to God and one that was under God's direction directly. You go do this, you go do that. Don't do this, don't do that. Very unusual thing, because in the New Testament on out to today, we have people saying that Satan's like, take this, God, and God's like, take that, Satan, and there's this battle. But in the Old Testament, God was in control. We also know that the Old Testament seems to assign all things, good and evil, and we showed this then, to God, not to ha-Satan in the Hebrew, and not to a New Testament nemesis that had the ability to counteract God and go against him. There's some things in the Old, but very, very little. The Jews didn't have that idea. It appears that somewhere between the Old Testament and the New Testament, Satan morphed from a being with a specific office to accuse, that was his Old Testament office, to becoming something of a tempter and a deceiver. The deceiver part seemed to come in a little bit more than. Not saying it wasn't always there, but it was just revealed more in the New Testament. R.H. Charles, he's an expert on the apocryphal texts of the New Testament, traces the early stages of Satan's transformation back to the apocryphal texts in the 2nd and 3rd century BC. There is also an idea that Persian demonology during the Jewish diaspora, that means when the Jews were scattered out after the Babylonian captivity, that this stuff started to help solidify Satan as an evil being rather than just a heavenly being that was assigned a job to go and accuse. It's interesting that after being baptized and God saying, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased," that the next thing we read in Matthew chapter 4 is, "Then was Jesus led up of the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted of the devil." Again, and because of the order of the way Satan suddenly comes out at the same time Jesus, being born of a woman and made flesh, comes out in the New Testament, I can't help but wonder, Daddy, wonder. I wonder, just wonder if when the Word became flesh, if somehow darkness also became personified in a being. Now, I just wonder why we would have such absence of information about Satan throughout most of the Old Testament, but when Jesus, the Word, became flesh, suddenly Satan becomes the absolute deceiver and embodiment of all darkness. Anyway, just a thought. So, when Jesus speaks of Satan as a murderer from the beginning, and our natural inclination is to view him as a dark being created by God to be evil, maybe he started off as a role, as an accuser, or maybe he started off processionally and consummately became more and more evil and embodied the spirit of darkness and death to where in time Jesus took on flesh, Satan was a full embodiment as well. In the New Testament, the liar and archenemy of God is best expressed in the book of Revelation, and which is where Satan appears to get a lot of stuff assigned to him. And beliefs about Satan held by Christians and Mormons alike are mostly derived from passages like Revelation 12:7 that say that Satan waged a war in heaven, and that he drew a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to earth. That's Revelation 12:4. And that he engaged in works of blasphemy and deceit. That's Revelation 13:1-14. And that he would be locked in a bottomless pit. That's Revelation 23. Most Christians and Mormons today see these passages as depicting scenes from before the earth was. That these are describing Satan before anything happened. Okay? But a number of biblical scholars think it's possible that what those passages are actually describing is an end time. an end time view of what Satan was doing, and which John clearly believed they were in when he wrote Revelation and also his epistles. So that's another way to kind of wonder about. Don't need to say it certainly, but just consider it. It didn't take long in Christianity, however, for Satan to be seen as the fallen angel who sought to be like God in the beginning of all things, and taking a third of the hosts of heaven, he was cast to earth to tempt and try to beguile us. I do believe that this subject can be discussed more within reason, revisited, not dogmatically, but with a little more attention to a couple things. The Garden of Eden term serpent, we talked about that. What does that mean? To the way Satan is described and used in Job, what does that mean relative to who he is, if it is a he? To how God accepts responsibility for good and evil throughout the Old Testament, says he does it, but now Satan in the New Testament times, he becomes the embodiment of all those things. How the description of the king of Babylon cannot be assigned to Satan, including the name Lucifer, cannot be assigned to Satan, at least not in the context with which it was written, and how Revelation may be describing end times and not pre-earth times of this accusatory force. So quickly, in Mormonism, the Book of Mormon speaks of Satan in the classic Christian sense. It says that he, quote, flattereth away and telleth them that there is no hell, and he saith unto them, I am no devil, and for there is none, end quote. That's from the Book of Mormon. This seems to be a direct rebuttal of a popular idea at Joseph Smith's time from the Universalists, who said there's no Satan and there's no hell. Early LDS views of Satan are very Christian. An angel of God who became the devil is how they would teach it. 2 Nephi 2:17 says, having sought that which was evil before God. So Satan had an independent spirit, created, ran amok, turned against God, arch enemy, nemesis. Mormonism puts that in very early in their ideas, where the Bible, Satan's not mentioned in Genesis. We say that. Later we learn that the serpent was the embodiment of Satan from Paul, but that goes into a whole Greek discussion that we won't take the time here. But Mormonism trumps this. What Joseph Smith did is say, I'm going to describe exactly what was going on in that Garden of Eden, and let me do it. And so he started speaking of Satan as this figure, a being, angelic being fallen, that was very active in that place. During Joseph Smith's life, nothing in the standard works of Mormonism, including recorded church history, says that Satan or his angels were fallen spirit children of God. Now remember, Mormons believe that we were all spirit children. Nothing during Joseph Smith's life or histories does he ever say that Satan was a spirit child of God. The notion that Satan and his angels were God's literal offspring didn't surface until after Joseph Smith died. And then it became kind of a standard for the faith. In a letter to William Smith, Joseph Smith's son, dated December 25th, 1844, W.W. Phelps said, quote, Lucifer, son of the morning, was the next heir to Jesus Christ, our eldest brother. This is where it got its legs. We didn't get it from before, though it could be interpreted as having been given before, but not directly from Smith. Then W.W. Phelps added that this Lucifer lost his first estate, quote, by offering to save men in their sins on the honor of a god or in his father's honor. It's a strange quote. So in my opinion, I believe that both the LDS and Christians today, to summarize it all before we go to the phone lines and the emails, is I think Christians and the LDS give far, far too much attention to Satan and his angels and darkness and to temptation. And that's my opinion. And while I know that the darkness continues to be a tangible thing in this life, and I know that evil certainly does exist in this life, which I believe is a better proof of God than to disprove God, I personally believe that Satan and his angels have been neutered, completely neutered by the finished work of Christ. Now, we do seem to continually face temptation, so it's possible that God allows Satan to continue to tempt us. But when I say neutered, I mean he has no power. There is no afterlife power of Satan if Christ has had the victory. And he can't have any long-term victory. All he's doing is rendering us ineffective as Christians and keeping those who don't accept Christ from accepting Christ. That's what he seems to be doing. But I think that 2,000 years ago, Christ had the victory, and Satan might allow be allowed to continue to cause chaos and corruption and even pull us from the light, but God wins. I don't think that Satan, after Christ had a victory on the cross and overcame all things, I don't think Satan has a leg to stand on. I think if ever the idea of Satan before God was pictured in Scripture of what he is presently, it's in Job. I think now Satan is going before God, and God's saying, hey, Satan, I want you to do this. Okay, all right. I want you to do this. Okay, all right. I think this battle ended on the cross. And when Christ rose from the grave, forget about it. The inclination of every Christian, instead of cursing the darkness, might be to shine a light. And I'm also of the opinion that prior to receiving Jesus, all people are naturally egocentric and self-centered, and that Satan might accentuate these natural inclinations that we have. But once a person has received the King, Satan is rendered neuter in their life unless we choose to invite him in and allow him to reign for a period of time. But if Christ is with us and we're seeking Christ, Satan can come and hold a donut in front of our face, but I just don't think there's any power at all. Could be wrong. Just some observations, but it seems in Mormonism and Christianity, there's a lot of people who love to focus on Satan and love to talk about his angels and demons and possession and blah. And I think it's better to focus on the Lord. He had the victory, and that's where you're going to find the strength in your life.